Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillips. Today we have Mark Finchem. He's a representative in the Southern Arizona District. Is that right?
That's correct.
And welcome to the show. We had a brief off-camera discussion about the ideas of equality and what equality is and the different debates in our society today on how equality should be attained. And of course, we're thinking about very different interpretations of this. One is equality of outcome, the other is equality of opportunity. And I know this is overplayed, as you mentioned, but I think you have some very good perspectives on this. And so,
well, thank you.
You can talk about, you mentioned before, you believe that this has kind of become a talking point, but there is something necessary to talk about within it.
Right.
So
you asked about the American dream while we were off camera, and it means so many different things to so many different people that when you hear people saying, I want to restore the American dream, what does that really mean? I don't think people really understand what the American dream sought out to be at the outset. So we the people, being in elected office for a number of years now, 5 years so far, I have a greater appreciation for the individual franchise of being an American citizen, that you have an individual right to exercise in so many different ways. And when we hear the two major political factions, one saying that they want to deliver equal outcomes, essentially mediocrity, and the other saying that they want to deliver on equal opportunity, I think that you have a real rift there in how do you deliver on those things that really enrich people's lives, their American dream. So I think our objective, at least at the state legislature, is to see to it that we act a bit as a referee, to see to it that we guard jealously the opportunity for people to have equal opportunity, an equal opportunity to take a bite at the apple for success. And everybody defines that differently. Now, the things that my constituents care about are personal freedom, economic security, a debt-free future, safe streets and schools, and a quality education, which really ties the first four all together. If you don't know, for example, what your civil rights are, how are you going to exercise them? If you don't know how to exercise your civil rights, sooner or later, you forget about them. So without having that interaction and holding elected officials accountable, we're on a slippery slope as a federal republic. And I think that it's the responsibility of state legislatures, of state legislators, no matter what part of the political spectrum they occupy, to see to it that we protect the opportunity, not the outcome.
That's interesting, and this ties into we're talking about the American dream. I'd say it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what is that, right?
Well, originally it was the pursuit of property.
That's right.
Life, liberty, and property, because some people would say you get really happy when you have property. Well, okay, if you go back to the framing of the original document, I think there was a recognition that not everybody was going to have property because we each make individual decisions about how we want to live our life. And when government begins to interfere with people making those personal decisions, that's where we really run into trouble.
Well, and that's why I think it's the pursuit of happiness.
Exactly.
And that is really a free, that's the free market. You should be able to try to create your dreams.
Right.
You should be able to try, you have the right to engage in things to build what you would like your life to be. And some people, unfortunately, make poor decisions, maybe because their idea of happiness is in short-term gain that doesn't have long-term, benefits. Sometimes happiness can be a bad thing, but freedoms allow us to make good decisions and poor decisions.
That's right. And one of my favorite historical figures is Adam Smith. The invisible hand of the free market. We quite often connect that with financial decisions. What about the invisible hand of ideas? The invisible hand of intuition to say, I don't think this is a good expense. If I were to draw this out game this out in a logical conclusion, if I buy a truck today that will fall apart in 4 years versus a house today that I will live in for a lifetime, that's an individual decision. That's a personal decision that's made for very personal reasons. Is it a wise investment? All depends. If you're a utilitarian and you need to have the truck in order to do your trade, your craft, then it's probably a wise decision. But if you're trading your capacity to earn for the big screen TV set, the really cool looking car, and you live in a dump, that's a personal decision. And I don't think that other people in society ought to be responsible for the decision that you make. It goes back to the pursuit of happiness. Who am I to tell you how to become happy, what to pursue to be happy? So I think that to look at Adam Smith in a little bit different light, the invisible hand of ideas and thinking through not just financial considerations, but how you'll serve your community. It's an amazing expansion of, I think, what he was talking about.
Interesting. I'm curious now, when you talk about the things that you've been asked to do, as a representative, and I'd say in a society today where I'd say the ideas of what government should play, the role government should play in everyday life, is being interpreted in different ways by different groups of people. You have people who, they want government to control basically everything. They want government to seize from their neighbor things that they don't have and give it to them because they're jealous of them and, or believe that they've been denied these things. When in reality, in my understanding at least, the role of government in the past was to help empower individuals to become independent and to make proper decisions. And sometimes the feedback loop of having consequences for bad decisions was part of the incentive for not doing them.
Right.
I think we're in an interesting society now where people don't want consequences for bad decisions. They don't, people.
No, but they want the goodies.
Yeah, they want the goodies, but
Yeah.
they don't want the consequences. And
Exactly.
So, and how do we begin managing a society that has gone in that direction?
Well, I think for starters, envy has been with us since the day of Cain and Abel. There was a homicide over envy, and that has continued to play out through the millennia. So I think that as much as some folks want to keep faith out of the public square, I find it amazing that when we have people in prison, for example, that when a prison ministry goes in and begins to deal with matters of the heart, what is your motivation? How do we see to it that you won't come back to prison? We see recidivism rates fall precipitously because people are like, well, I was never exposed to this when I was a kid. All right, well, I'm not advocating for teaching Bible lessons in public schools. That's not what I'm saying. But I do believe that probably the most important personal decision that we can make is school choice. How do we educate our children? Do we educate them on how to think? Do we challenge their capacity to develop case theory, to really encourage them to be critical thinkers? Or do we define what critical thinking is and then tell them what to think?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting point that ties a lot into classical education versus modern education. And that also ties into the ideas between whether we're teaching kids, like I'd say, modern technical intelligence or moral wisdom. Traditional society, if you look at many societies, Western education, classical education, you read the Greek classics, you read Aristotle and his ethics, the idea of virtue and what it meant to be a virtuous person and how this was the source of happiness in life. You read, different writers like, Marcus Aurelius, who talked about the ideas of being able to endure the hardships of life and how to balance the things you'll face in life. If you go to even ancient China, you had the four classics. You had the book of forms, rules of etiquette.
You're well read, man.
I read a lot. Yeah, you had the. You had books on poetry.
Right.
You had the Confucian writings and stuff like that. And then you had the I Ching. Those are the four books.
And there are some things that I think there's this notion. In fact, we heard this a couple of years on the Arizona legislative floor in the House. A bunch of old white men wrote a bunch of rules that we really should go back and revisit. Okay, Representative, I'm going to forgive your ignorance in this because you probably weren't taught that many of the framers of the Constitution were under 24 years old. They weren't old white men. However, they were well-educated men, that they had gone through rigorous education in their younger years. They knew how to read, write, do complicated mathematics, and all the books that you had referenced earlier. They also knew about the book of Proverbs, which, by the way, people say, well, there isn't a manual for life. Actually, there is. If you take it out of the context of being a religious book for just a moment, and yes, I'm kind of speaking to my atheist friends, is there any portion of the book of Proverbs that you can say is untrue? I would say no. Because if you do those things, you will have a prosperous life. And when you don't do those things, it doesn't end so well.
And this ties into an interesting principle of how our society was created by the Founding Fathers.
Exactly.
It was created for a moral people.
Because it's unfit for any other.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
There you go. And it's interesting because I have friends from Europe and other countries, and they have standardized educations, standardized questions. A lot of it's based on memorization. A lot of it's technical, true or false, A, B, C type answers. That doesn't relate to the type of education maybe people of my generation had, where a lot of it was kind of free form. A lot of it was you had to write out your answers. You had to think for yourself. And I think this is one of the things that form the character of Americans, right? You have some people who don't have creative wisdom. They're not able to think outside the box. And this goes back to even like to Tocqueville and stuff like that, talking about the character of Americans. Yeah. Where in France, if they needed a bridge, they'd petition the government and rally, ask the government for it, and eventually maybe the government would do it. As opposed to Americans who said, we need a bridge, let's go build it. Right. Americans think for themselves. They think, what should I do? How can I do what I need to do? And in the moment, they're not afraid to make decisions for themselves. This even goes into our military.
Yeah.
I've read some great stories about this. I've read stories where, with a lot of squads and stuff like that in combat, if you kill their squad leader, their commander, they freeze up. They don't know what to do because there's no one giving them commands.
That's right.
In the American military, every man is taught to lead.
That's right.
And so I've read that you shoot the squad leader, they become more aggressive because the guy next to them has has less restraint. They'll charge you. Yeah. And that really says something about the American character.
Well, there's also a great example that is actually real time. So Deming, New Mexico, near the Mexico border. This American ingenuity is at work. So President Trump ran into some difficulty with a certain political party, didn't want the wall built. People in that area wanted the wall, and they said, okay, how about we do a GoFundMe page and we raise a bunch of money. They raised $20 million. Well, the terms of the GoFundMe, as I understand it, were that they would have to give the money to the federal government. However, the federal government said, time out. That'll go into the general fund and we can't spend it on the wall, even though that was the condition of receiving the money in the first place. Makes sense. They said, okay, well, what if we just build it ourselves? GoFundMe said, well, you can do that, but you're going to have to go back to each and every one of your contributors and tell them that you're not spending the money with the government, that you're going to spend it yourself, and you're going to build a wall. I believe it was Candace Owens had Steve Bannon on, and they were talking about this, and they went back and got $16 million of the $20 million approved by everybody who'd made a contribution to spend it privately. They built a wall on private land with private funds and a private contractor.
Yeah, I remember
in an area where the Corps of Engineers said, this is too rough a terrain for us to do this. They found a way, and they interrupted 19 footpaths for the importation of dangerous drugs, of human trafficking, and for anybody who wants to say that we kicked slavery back in 1865, I got news for you. There's modern day slavery that's going on right now on the southern border, and people seem to be turning a blind eye to it. Because I'm from Arizona, we're very familiar with this. So my message to the people of the United States, you really want to end slavery? We need to put an end to the cartels shipping people across the border and killing those who get across the border without using their service.
Yeah, it's true. I'm sure the people who follow Epic Times, they've seen our border coverage. We have reporters at the border. And, even we're finding children, reports that I guess you don't see in a lot of the mainstream media, children being trafficked because they're being used as tools by the traffickers to,
That's right.
play on people's emotions and things like this and, manipulate our laws.
And they do that in a couple of different ways.
Kids being traded back and forth.
Exactly. Trading kids, kids being pressed into sex slavery. I mean, we're supposed to be protecting children. Instead, we've got this squabble going in Washington, D.C. about whether or not there's a crisis. I'm here to tell you, as somebody on the southern border, there's a crisis. And it's a crisis that's affecting children. When you are, and it just blows my mind, that parents would turn their children over to a coyote for rent to make up a fake family to bring people across the border.
And it's happening.
You want to talk about ethics? You want to talk about virtue? I'm really glad that America is a virtuous nation. I believe with all my heart that we will probably be the last virtuous nation left on the planet when all others fall away. Because we have good people in this nation. We have people who care. And for particular news outlets to make the claim that Americans, or a certain segment of Americans, don't care, that's a fallacious argument. There's nothing to back that up. But I think that we've got an opportunity to show the world we know how to manage our border. I'm so glad that Mexico has stepped up. That's a huge win for not just the United States, but also for Mexico.
And one of the ideas, of America, it's changed a little bit. I'd say quite a bit. America was supposed to be the shining city on the hill, the model for success for a functioning government and a constitutional, a country run by a constitution, and not some giant welfare state to subsidize, regimes and these things and, give money out. It was meant to work as an example to, run a country by. And if you look at the successful democracies in the world, if you look at the countries that do have, good constitutions, it was because they followed the American model. It wasn't because we gave them money. It wasn't because we bailed them out. Sometimes we did. But really, we showed them the way it could be, and we gave them a model to live by. And that was really the most effective thing, I think, in this world.
There's also a second ingredient. You had a polity that yearned for liberty. So look at and I think that America has been over the years guilty of trying to be a nation builder. I mean, you go into a culture that is a theocracy and you try to install a democracy, it's not going to work. Partly because there's an allegiance to the theocracy because of faith, but also because you have folks who, they just don't have that yearning for freedom. They have a yearning for comfort. And when you trade one for another, generally you get neither.
Yeah, and it's a good example too of the problems of trying to force things on people they don't want. When you get into the idea of government intervention in places where there's no demand for such intervention.
Well, and I mean, do we have it perfect? Not by a long shot. But, and I'm not sure who the famous dignitary is from the past that said this, democracy's messy. But it's also the cleanest form of government that has been able to survive over 250 years.
Yeah, well, when you have a society where people are allowed to make their own decisions, you'll have many people make good decisions, you'll have some make bad decisions. And that's part of what freedom is. Just like with free speech. Part of free speech is being able to tolerate speech you don't enjoy hearing. When we talk about
and
freedom,
also to accept the consequences of exercising your free speech.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. And that's the cost of a free society, is that you might make bad decisions. You might say things you probably shouldn't say. And you have to deal with that from other people. To have freedom, you need to tolerate sometimes the freedom of others. And you might not enjoy that sometimes, but that's part of the price we pay. And really, I think the alternative to that is the horrifying picture, as we've seen over the last 100 years, tried over and over again.
When you have people who try to impress, and this is one of the faults that I have with the whole concept of nation building, when you have one nation trying to impress its vision of governance on another nation that's either not ready for it, is not interested in it. I mean, take a look at what we've done in the Middle East over the last, 25 years. It's not a government suitable for that culture until they want it. Once they want it, once they have a yearning for it, once they want to move away from a theocracy and move to a government by the people, for the people, of the people, that's when the seeds of democracy really can take root. But to try and impress that upon people that are not ready for it, it's doomed to failure, in my opinion. But we have the opportunity to be the example, and I think that we set a good example.
Great. So where can people find out more about your work and what you do?
Well, if they want to visit the Arizona Legislature's page, it's azleg.gov. We actually broadcast our sessions, all of our committee meetings, real time. Although we're out of session right now, you'll be seeing pre-recorded messages. But during session, our session typically starts on the third Monday of every January. And we run until we're done, usually about 110 days. This year we had a long session at 135. But you're able to watch the bills, the antics, the craziness that is democracy on our floor. It's, for anybody who likes political theater, it's a great watch.
Hey, real pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.